if we're trying to send a signal for parents that Alaska is a great place for education, I think the best signal that we can send is test scores and performance. Unfortunately, we're not doing so well in that. I don't think we can make up for that with more funding. I think you actually come to a point if your scores have not gone up and you continue to fund them or increase funding, that you actually are putting downward pressure on performance by maintaining the status quo. Unfortunately, the status quo is terrible in Alaska.
All right, thank you very much. There's been a lot of interesting comments on this bill today, and I appreciate everybody's thoughtfulness. This bill is a really big, really is a big policy call, and as I mentioned, we didn't get any amendments on it, although I certainly look forward to working with the Finance Committee members on further refinements of the bill moving forward. I will just address that the statutory formula of the permanent fund dividend would create a $1.5 billion fiscal gap next year, and clearly that's something that we just can't afford to do anymore. And I think that the people of Alaska deserve some transparency about what kind of a dividend that they can expect. I also think that it would resolve a political problem for the legislature, which is that every year we're appropriating on an annual basis. And a lot of folks feel frustrated that we're ignoring a statutory formula. And I believe that when we can afford our statutory formulas, we fund them. And I want to create some fiscal stability for the future of Alaska. I think there's some good comments about education and the importance of education, and how it is that this bill could intersect with other policy proposals that are before the legislature right now. And there are a series of bills that seek to address some of the education challenges in our state. Before I talk about those, I want to point out that we spend $500 less per child today than we did in fiscal year 08 for public education when you adjust our base student allocation dollars and people according to inflation. So that's my oldest daughter is almost 24 years old. She was 10 years old in 2008. She is getting ready to graduate from college and, a full-grown adult, and that's how long it's been since we've made meaningful changes in our base student allocation. Representative Story has a couple of bills to do that. House Bill 272 would rebase our base student allocation to adjust for the inflation that's taken place over the last few years, and then House Bill 273 would attach the base student allocation to inflation moving forward. And I think those are really important, because the reason that our educational outcomes in Alaska, when ranked comparing to other states, have dropped, it's not that our educational outcomes are actually much worse than they were back in 2008, for example. It's that other states have made those strategic investments, and you have conservative states all across the country investing things like pre-K. It certainly seems like those are the kinds of things that we should be doing in Alaska. And those other states made those investments in evidence-based strategies like evidence-based reading programs, pre-K. We're the only state in the nation that doesn't have a defined benefit retirement plan for our educators. And that's resulting in poor educational, professional retention. So other states have made these strategic investments, have prioritized public education. And they've jumped past us essentially in the performance metrics. And that's the reason it's really important that we start addressing the erosion of our purchasing power in public education. There's also a bill to, adopt many of those evidence-based reading programs in pre-K. There's a defined benefit program. We could address all of these in other legislation. And it was my intention to allow local jurisdictions across the state to be able to determine for themselves how they would like to spend these additional dollars. But certainly I'm happy to work with Finance Committee members on, possible amendments to more narrowly tailor the bill. But essentially, I believe that we need to start making investments in public education, and we can't afford an unsustainable dividend formula. And that's the reason that I introduced House Bill 259. And I thank everybody for the work on this issue. We're going to work on this issue a lot more over the coming months. And with that, I'd happily consider a motion.
Chair Sponholz, I move HB 259, work order number 32-LS1362/A from committee with attached recommendations and fiscal note.
Is there an objection? All right, seeing no objection, House Bill 259 moves from committee. We will sign the paperwork at the end of the committee meeting today. I want to make sure that we get our Finance Committee members out of here in time. And I want to welcome Representative Schrage at 11:49 a.m. this morning. All right, so next up, we're going to go to a presentation by Legislative Finance Director Alexi Painter on inactive funds. Oh, hang on just a second. I've been informed that we have a time sensitivity. Oh, no, we're good. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Sponholz. For the record, Alexi Painter, Legislative Finance Division. And I was asked to discuss inactive funds in the context of House Bill 223 and also just more broadly. And in particular, I'm going to touch on the impact of the CBR sweep on some of the fund balances because that changed the picture a bit from a year ago when this legislation was drafted. So before we get started, I want to differentiate between funds and fund codes. So each fund source that we spend in the budget has a fund code, which is a 4-digit identifier that legislative finance assigns. They all start with a 1, so it starts with a CBR, that's 1001. And the latest we had was established in this current year's budget, it's 1272. These fund codes often come from a particular fund within the state treasury, but sometimes they're used to just identify a revenue source that's not kept in a particular fund in the treasury or in the general fund. So it's a fund source, not necessarily an actual fund in the treasury. Each fund in the treasury also has a code. If it's one that we spend in the budget, that's the same code as our code that we use in the budget. There's a lot of accounting codes as well that are not spent in the budget. So that's code funds that either flow without further appropriation or roll up to a fund code. So sometimes you'll have a situation where we use a fund code that's more broad than what the accounting system does. So you'll see these other fund codes. Usually they start with a 3. So you can identify the difference if you're looking at a bunch of fund codes. If you see something start with a 1, it's something we spend in the budget. If you see something start with a 3, generally it's not something we spend in the budget. And there's a few resources if you want to learn more about funds. The Department of Administration's Division of Finance has some information on their website. It's kind of more technical. On the Legislative Finance website, we have our fund code kind of repository of history. So you can sort through them on that website and look at which ones are sweepable, which are not, look at them by active or inactive and by fund group. And for each one, we have a description of the fund and its history. And that's a pretty good resource if you want to learn more about them. Also, if you're looking at one of our budget reports online, if you click the fund code, you can get to that fund source report that has the background about it. So if you want to learn more about various funds, we have a lot of resources to spend hours of really nerdy fun if you want. So of our 272 fund codes that we have assigned, 106 of them are currently marked as inactive. We mark them as inactive for a variety of reasons, generally when they're not being used in the budget for a significant amount of time, and we don't expect them to be. So sometimes that's because the actual fund itself was repealed by the legislature. So the example I have here is the Four-Dam Pool Transfer Fund. Once the Four-Dam Pool project was sold, there was no need to retain that fund, and so the legislature repealed that fund in 1999. Therefore, there's no money in Fund Code 1090, so it's inactive in our system. Sometimes we inactivate things because they were one-offs. Sometimes we'll see that we established like a fund code for the federal stimulus bill in 2008 to track the funding from that. After a while, that no longer had relevance, so we inactivated the fund code. So then funds themselves, often established in statute and will remain even after the underlying program or the original purpose no longer exists. And sometimes they even keep a balance for years on end because it's a relatively small amount, so nobody's going and grabbing it. And while the administrative burden associated with most of these funds are pretty low, there may be some efficiencies or balances to recover if they're repealed. If nothing else, it's a good exercise in kind of cleaning up our statutes so there's not these old funds sitting around that can cause confusion sometimes. And I understand that's the purpose of House Bill 223 is to try to clean up some of these funds that are no longer in use. However, not all inactive funds can actually be repealed. Some of them have ongoing obligations, even if the original purpose is gone. So an example of one of the oldest ones like that, the Mining Revolving Loan Fund has not actually given any loans since 1986. However, there's still $200,000 in that fund as a foreclosure reserve for a single remaining asset in the portfolio. So you can't actually repeal that fund until that asset has been disposed of or until the loan is completely done. So even though that fund has not been used in 36 years, it still can't really be repealed at this point. There's others where there's ongoing past capital appropriations that are still outstanding. There's actually an example of that in this bill, which is the Railbot Energy Fund. That actual fund has not really been used for its intended purposes in over 20 years, but there are still some capital projects on the books from that. So you can't just repeal the fund because those obligations remain. And so, when you're looking at which funds can we actually repeal, it becomes a much smaller list than the list of all the outstanding inactive funds that are out there. And so, as they were going through this bill, there were a lot of potential ones that there were just too many complications to repeal in this bill, and that narrowed the list down quite a bit. And the sponsor will talk about that later, but I just want to kind of throw that out there that, it may seem simple, okay, we'll just get rid of the funds that we don't need, we're done. But since the legislature often will continue to appropriate funds from these or reappropriate old capital projects, sometimes they can hang around much longer than you'd think. So some of the inactive funds are subject to the constitutional sweep provision, Article 9, Section 17D of the Constitution, whereby at the end of the fiscal year, if the general fund owes a liability to the CBR, the general fund and its subaccounts are swept to the CBR. And so several of these funds that had retained balances for many years are now empty because the FY21 sweep was not reversed. So that cleared out the balances of quite a few of our old inactive funds, as well as many active funds. There are still some funds that are inactive that are not subject to the sweep, often because they can be spent by the agencies without further appropriation, therefore they're not sweepable, or because they're part of a revolving loan fund or some other reason why they have to be kept outside the sweep. So there are still some without balances or with balances after the sweep, but it's a lot fewer, and those ones that remain tend to be a little more complex to handle.
Vice Chair Will.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the inactive funds that were swept in FY21, the biggest one on this page is the Railbot Energy Fund, and the next biggest is the Originator's Surety Fund. They're both, one's a code 3, one's a code 1. Code 1 means it's typically used in the budget. So what are the ramifications of the Railbot Energy Fund being swept? And is that a fund that's replenished annually through fees or whatever? And maybe just curiosity, what is the Originator Surety Fund?
Through the Chair, Representative Will, so I have a slide a little later about the Railbot Energy Fund that goes into that. Originator Surety Fund, don't recall the history of that off the top of my head, but that's one that's been marked inactive in the by the Division of Finance for many years. It's not one that we spent directly in the budget, but they've marked it as sweepable. And I do not know the history of that one since we don't have a fund code for it.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
All right, so that takes us to our next slide here, which shows the funds that we've marked as inactive, or the Division of Finance has marked as inactive, but were swept in FY21. We have the estimated amount swept. We should get the actual amount in a matter of days here as the audited financials come out. As Representative Wool pointed out, the largest is the Railbot Energy Fund, which I'll get to in a couple of slides. Some of these have very small amounts of money, $194, $45. The next largest is the Municipal Capital Project Matching Program. That's a program that hasn't been used in, I think, since the early 2000s. The legislature did spend some of those funds from that fund and the Unincorporated Community Project Matching Grant Fund for other purposes, but still left a small balance. That has now been swept. So these amounts were just sitting out there, could have been used for another purpose or moved to the general fund. Now they have been moved to the CBR. And so those balances are no longer available. Next slide shows the inactive funds that are not subject to the sweep that have a balance. And so several of these are not subject to the sweep because they can be spent without further appropriation or revolving loan funds. The largest one is the Capstone Avionics Revolving Loan Fund. This one, the fund has actually already been repealed by statute. So the reason the balance is still there is because there are outstanding capital projects. So that one, while the statutory reference no longer exists, there are still some outstanding obligations. So the fund will kind of remain on the books. And eventually when those capital projects go away, it can be cleared out. The next largest is the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation's Capital Fund, or the HCC account, the Housing Capital Corporation. This one was established, it's often called the parking garage because it was established several years ago in order to be a non-sweepable fund because it's a corporate fund. This fund was capitalized by the legislature putting money into it and then as just an appropriation, and then spending it on capital projects. It was completely appropriated for capital projects, but as those projects have lapsed, that's brought money back into the account. There's still quite a few outstanding projects, even though it hasn't been used in a decade or so, and so we can't completely close the books on that one, but it has no ongoing source of revenue, so there's no real reason to keep it other than that it's kind of handy to have this non-sweepable parking garage that could be used for any purpose. It has no corporate purpose despite being a corporate fund. It was created solely for the purpose of giving the legislature a non-sweepable place to put money. And then a couple of the other funds here are dealt with in the bill, so I'll give more history as we get there.
Are there any questions on this slide before we move on? You said that on the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation Capital Fund, the parking garage, that it hasn't been used in a decade?
Chair Sponholz, yes, I think, I'm trying to remember the last year we used it, but it hasn't been used in a significant amount in quite a while, and the uses have been just as projects lapse back in, there's money available. It does spend as UGF, so there's not really usually much advantage to choosing to spend that versus general funds on something, but that has been used. The initial capitalization was well over a decade ago and mostly was spent in the first few years.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions on this slide before we move on? Rep. Story? No?
Yes, thank you. The Fund for the Improvement of School Performance. I could have some background on that, please.
Sure. Representative Story through the chair. So this fund has not been used, I think, in at least 20 years. This isn't one in the bill, but in discussions with the department, it's not an active use. There is now a Curriculum Improvement and Best Practices Fund that was established, although never used as well. So with sort of a similar goal. This is an example of a fund that had no source of revenue, so it was just a place the legislature could put money and then spend it on a particular purpose. That's not really in keeping with our kind of constitutional system of no dedicated funds. So putting money into that, and then it wasn't really an endowment. I think it just never really served much of a purpose, or hasn't for a long time, for the legislature to have that fund. There is still $21,000 that could be spent on something, but I think when we discussed this with the department, it hadn't been used at all in at least a couple of decades. And so that's why it doesn't have a fund code, is that it predates the time of our budget system from 2000.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll go through the funds proposed for repeal in House Bill 223 and provide some background on these funds. I think Representative Kaufman will get into the policy questions here, but I'll just try to provide some history. Most of this just comes from our fund code write-ups that are on our website if you want more information. So starting with the Railbot Energy Fund that Representative Wool asked about, this is subject to the CBR sweep, so the balance is currently zero. This was established in 1986 for the purpose of meeting railbelt energy needs, including projects for retrofitting state-owned buildings and facilities for energy conservation. And so it was originally established by appropriating $412.6 million to the fund, but it does not have an ongoing source of revenue. So it was just, in the 80s when we had significant surpluses, was putting money aside for a particular purpose. The remaining balance of that fund was appropriated in FY 2012, and I think it had been mostly expended by the 90s, but there were some amounts remaining up through FY 2012. As projects have lapsed back to the fund, it rebuilt a balance up to about $3.5 million before the CBR sweep brought that back to zero. And so since it's a fund with no ongoing source of revenue and then no money, it's kind of an empty endowment. You could put money back in there and start spending it for that purpose, but since that original capitalization is gone, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose anymore. But as I noted earlier, there are still some capital projects outstanding from it that may make a repeal a little more complicated. It may need to be delayed.
We've got a question on this from.
I'm sorry.
No? One. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, going on to the next one, Code 1065, the Rural Electrification Revolving Loan Fund. This was established as a fund within the Alaska Energy Authority back in 1981 with a $6.5 million capitalization at the time. The intent of this fund was to make loans available to rural utilities that did not have access to a different fund source at the time, the Rural Electrification Administration, or REA loan programs, where they were having difficulty obtaining REA fund loans because of federal reductions to that program. This program was largely supplanted by a different one in the 1990s, the Electrical Service Extension Fund. And so the loans, at that point, no new loans were given out after that new fund was created. Payments on outstanding loans continued to be received until FY08. And rather than being put back into new loans, they were typically appropriated for electricity-related capital projects. And so there's no outstanding funds in this, money in this fund, or any outstanding loans from this fund anymore. Seeing no questions, going on to 1086.
Painter, before you move on, could we just back up one slide? I thought you said that the Railbelt Energy Fund still had some outstanding projects that were out there, but the slide says that it's essentially an empty endowment. Which one is correct?
Chair Sponholtz, so it's empty because there's no unobligated balance. There are still some capital projects outstanding from it, but there's no funds available for any other purpose. When those projects are completed, there may be some small lapsing balances that would go back into the fund, or they may be reappropriated if those funds are completely expended.
Okay. If the funds are not entirely expended in this, if the dollars are not completely expended, and they would ordinarily go back, and we were to pass this bill in its current form, what would happen to those dollars?
Chair Sponholtz, when those it depends on whether we had the CBR sweep, reverse sweep vote. If there was no reverse sweep vote, then the funds would simply end up in the CBR. If there was a reverse sweep, it would be a little ambiguous what should happen with the fund, where if they're lapsing back to a fund that no longer exists, it is a little confusing to know exactly whether they're still there or whether they would go back into the general fund. We would probably recommend putting language in the budget as those lapse to appropriate them back to the general fund if we are not relying on the CBR sweep to clean them out.
All right, thank you. And before you move on, I just want to recognize that Representative Prax joined us at 12:04. All right, any other questions? No? All right, go ahead.
Okay, so going on to slide 12, the Southeast Energy Fund. And so this was created with an ongoing source of revenue at first, which was 40% of the four-dam pool fund, which consisted of loan payments from the Alaska Energy Authority. However, in 1999, the legislature redirected those payments to the Power Cost Equalization Endowment Fund, which essentially took away that ongoing source of revenue from this fund. There was a single grant that was made out of these funds in 1996 for the Swan Lake Tyee Intertie in Southeast Alaska. The remaining balance of the fund was appropriated back to the general fund in 2006. The fund no longer has a source of revenue because of that change back in 1999, and there's no fund balance remaining because of the appropriation back in 2006. Okay, Code 1260, the Curriculum Improvement and Best Practices Fund. This is by far the newest fund on the list. So back in 2018, the legislature passed a bill that created a one-time capitalization of this fund to fund a 3-year pilot program to test the appropriateness and effectiveness of curricula. So the fiscal note called for $19.5 million to go into the fund in FY19. But then on the House floor that session, the capitalization was given a delayed effective date to FY20. So the funds did not go into the fund in FY19 as the fiscal note indicated. That got delayed till FY20. The following year, the legislature repealed that capitalization before it happened. So the money never actually went into the fund. And so the fund was never used. And that essentially defunded that bill to test and do the pilot program for new curricula. So that work didn't really occur, and this fund was never actually used because of that repeal.
And do we have, I presume that we have other funds, Mr. Painter, that funds that we could, where we could appropriate to for the purposes of improving curriculum and best practices in education?
Chair Sponholz, this fund was designed for a pretty specific 3-year pilot program. So if we wanted to specifically do the purposes of that bill, it was Senator McKinnon's bill from 4 years ago, I think that would be an appropriate place. If your goal was just to more generally support curriculum, then this particular fund probably would not be as appropriate, since it tied back to that statute about the 3-year pilot program.
I remember that project now. Thank you. Any other questions? All right, no, go ahead.
Okay, the next one is one that we have not directly spent in the budget since we've had a budget system. So it has a code with a 3205, the Alaska Historical Commission receipts account. It's subject to the CBR sweep, so the fund balance is 0. It used to be used to track expenditures of the Alaska Historical Commission within DNR. It's no longer in use by the commission at all, and in fact, when we asked them about it, the commission was not aware that the fund even still existed. It hasn't been used in well over 20 years.
I believe that my brother worked for the Alaska Historical Commission back in the day when he was in between undergrad and graduate school. He's now a historian. All right. Is there any questions on this? No? All right, go ahead.
Okay, so the next one is code 3206, the Fuel Emergency Fund. This one does have a balance, $22,000. This was used in the early 1990s for the purpose of when the governor determined that a shortage of fuel in a community was sufficiently severe to justify state assistance to make grants to any political subdivision. This fund could be used to purchase emergency supplies of fuel for that municipality or other local government. In 2000, the Disaster Relief Fund statute was amended to add fuel shortages of an allowable use for that fund. So this fund was no longer necessary because that larger fund that has more ongoing uses could be used for that same purpose. So this fund has not been used since 2000. And so this fund is no longer necessary, but there's still $22,000 left from the last time it was used. Okay, next one is the Exxon Valdez oil spill unincorporated rural community grant funds. This was established in 1992 from the civil side. The payment from the Alaska Pipeline Company to the state of Alaska stemming from the Exxon Valdez oil spill. We're probably all familiar with EVOS Fund, the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trust. That comes from the criminal fines paid by Exxon, and those are maintained for long-term purposes. This was part of a payment that was used for grants specifically for habitat mitigation at the time. This particular sub-fund was for grants to unincorporated rural communities in the affected area. Those grants went out to those communities, and there are no funds remaining from this civil settlement. While there are still funds remaining in the criminal side, the 29.7 has been fully expended at this point.
Right. Go ahead.
Okay, and I think this is the last one, the Alaska Affordable Energy Fund. So this one is another one that has never been used. It is designated to receive 20% of royalties from a future AKLNG project, Alaska Liquefied Natural Gas Project. Part of past legislation relating to an AKLNG project. It was established for the purpose of developing energy infrastructure for areas that do not have access to the AKLNG line. As we all know, we do not have an AKLNG line at this point, so this fund has never been used. You could keep it on the books in case that ever occurs, or perhaps it is relatively unlikely, so it can be addressed if that ever comes up.
All right, no questions.
All right, with that, the chair, that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any other questions before I turn it over.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Painter before we move on? Representative Josephson.
Through the chair, Mr. Painter, just on the last slide, is that the Alaska Liquefied Natural Gas Fund, is that what did that come out of House Bill 4 or 138? If I've got the number, was it the small line or the large line?
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, I do not remember which bill that came out of, whether it was related to the bullet line or the larger line, but I think it would work. It's designed so that any AKLNG line, 20% of the royalties would go in, but I do not recall which of the two. I can get back to you with that.
Okay. Just a comment that one, this fund seems like something that is not very remote in time, and of course, we still have an AGDC that is active and maybe less active than it was, but just a thought. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? All right, no, it looks like you're done. Thanks so much. Next up, we're going to go to Marie Marks with Legislative Legal, who's going to walk us through a memo that was provided to us with House Bill 223's supporting documents. It's a pretty lengthy legal memo, and so we asked Ms. Marks to walk us through it.
Yes, good afternoon. For the record, my name is Marie Marks with Legislative Legal Services. It is a lengthy memo, but my comments, I think, will be fairly brief, I hope. HB 223 currently repeals 8 funds, which I understand they're no longer active from the testimony we just heard. The bill is very short, and it just simply repeals each fund's enabling statute. And repealing these funds does not require any other changes to be made to Alaska statutes. And my memo dated May 8th, 2021 discusses a legal issue with repealing other state funds and subsequently associated statutes in one bill. And the issue that is raised in the memo is that under Article 2, Section 13 of the Alaska Constitution, substantive bills must be confined to one subject, and this is commonly known as a single subject rule. This rule requires that all matters in an act fall under some one general idea, be so connected with or related to each other, either logically or in popular understanding, as to be parts of or germane to one general subject. And this is significant because failure to comply with a single subject rule could jeopardize the entire bill if it was ever challenged. So my memo, in essence, says that if the bill were to include funds that require changes to other statutes, there is a significant risk that the bill would violate the single subject rule. The single subject would no longer be simply, inactive state funds or these defunct funds. And so I strongly recommend that repealing funds that require other changes to statutes be made in separate bills that are confined to one single subject. And that is really the essence of my comments, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, Representative Eastman has a question for you.
Thank you. I appreciate your explanation just there. As I'm looking at the bill, I think the question that I have dealing with single subject is more to the effect of once the bill is into effect and there is some money left in some of these funds currently, what happens to those funds? Is it a violation of the single subject rule, in your opinion, for those funds to be moved to some other location? I know historically there's been a distinction between appropriation bills and changes to statute. I could certainly see an argument where someone could tell the court that we're moving, funds because the fund no longer exists, which kind of seems to be part of the same subject. But what are your thoughts on that?
Through the chair, Representative Eastman, any transfer of money from the fund to somewhere else, to a new purpose or new entity, would require an appropriation. So no, there could not be a transfer of existing money without a corresponding appropriation bill. And I could have Mr. Painter talk further about that process, but there will be an appropriation bill. If there is money left in the fund at the time of repeal, there would need to be an appropriation bill that appropriates that money to a new fund or a new place.
Follow
Follow
up?
up? Mm-hmm.
And so it's your understanding then that there's no way to accomplish that in this particular bill. That would have to be a separate piece of legislation.
Through the chair, Representative Eastman, that is correct. To actually transfer the money would require an appropriation bill. This bill before you just repeals the funds themselves. It doesn't effectuate any transfer of money.
And follow up?
Uh-huh.
And just to get to the finer point of what transfer means, these funds, some of them are sort of within other funds. Would the elimination of these funds simply cause that money to fall into that larger fund, or would you be considering that a transfer as well?
Through the chair, Representative Eastman, I don't think there's a clear answer on that. I think there is a strong argument that it could, but my recommendation is to avoid any legal question is to appropriate any remaining money in an appropriation bill.
Thank you.
All right, are there other questions for Ms. Marks while we've got her? All right, there's no additional questions for you at this time, Ms. Marks. Thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it. We're going to take a brief Eddies.
Thank you.
4 p.m. And with that, we're going to move next up to the presentation from Representative Kaufman on House Bill 223. So if you can proceed forward. Do you have a PowerPoint presentation, or are you just going to talk?
No, ma'am, I'm just gonna, I'm barely gonna talk at this point.
Great. We like to be efficient in this committee.
There you go. First off, I'm Representative James Kaufman, District 28, Anchorage Hillside. So through the chair, the purpose of this was really just to go look for forgotten accounts that were really just accounting clutter. And even better if there was money there that maybe had been sitting dormant that we could capture. And that's really it. So as we've heard from both legal and finance, there's difficulty in repealing certain funds, and there's stakeholders that may still be engaged with some of these. And so I think as we go through the committee process, the list may evolve. And that's no harm if it does. It could grow or it could shrink. Doesn't really matter because what we're really trying to do is just do some cleanup on things. And if you have to work with these account codes and you're tripping over them, they're there and you never use them, why have them? And it's easy, as I understand, for us to make new accounts if we need them. And so why keep the old ones if they're no longer needed? So with all of the excellent testimony that we've already had, I'll rest my case and say that the purpose of this bill is to end up where we can in deleting accounts that we don't need, codes, and we'll keep the ones that are good, that we have some need as the need emerges or is further defined in these hearings. Thank you.
You want to talk a little bit, Representative Kaufman, about the process you use for narrowing down the number of funds that you selected, council that you selected?
It was just time and inactivity was the first cut, and then just look for those that have been sitting dormant was really it. And then after that, it began to be what was legally or financially possible if there was still in some cases there's not been recent activity, but there's still some pending action that we know is out there. So as you go through them, the list got whittled. And like I said, it may get whittled more, or we may find a few more that we can add. But the single subject rule and the any pending financial activity out there that's the two things that kind of bracketed us down. At first, we thought we'd hit a gold mine. Hey, look at all this, but it got whittled down quite a bit. Thank you.
Nothing is ever quite as simple as we think it's going to be in the legislature, we find, Representative Kaufman.
No,
I sort of, summarize that this is sort of like looking through the couch cushions to try to find the pocket change and tidy up a little bit along the way, which certainly makes sense and is one of the objectives of this committee for sure. Are there any questions for Representative Kaufman? All right, we have a pretty quiet committee today. Thank you very much for your time today. You're off the hook. Would you like to make any wrap-up remarks?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Through the chair, I'd just like to say thank you for the excellent testimony from Ms. Marks and Mr. Painter. They plowed a pretty wide road for me, so I didn't need to talk too much, and I thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very much. I think the thoughtful process that you went through in working with Ledge Legal and with our finance team yields fewer questions today for you, the bill sponsor. And with that concludes our business for today. We're going to have our next meeting on Tuesday, March 1st at 11:30 a.m. here in Davis Room 106. We'll be hearing a presentation from the work of New York State's Spending and Government Efficiency Commission. It's also called the SAGE Commission. And with that, this meeting of the House Special Committee on Ways and Means is adjourned at 12:28 p.m.
Hello, my fellow Alaskans. Man, I'm not. There we are. Hey, sorry about that. It took me a second to get the audio connected back up there again. We just got done listening to HB 259, the breakdown of the financials and kind of more, not more or less the financials, but the legal law lingo that is going behind this. This completely repeals the statutory PFD law and gives 50% of the PFD POMV draw that they want directly to education, which would be about a $255 million increase to their current budget. If they were to actually follow the laws for student-based allocation for education, there has been a 10% decrease statewide for students that are going to school in just this past year. That doesn't include the drop in student-based population over the last 10 years. That's just in this past year. Not at once and throughout all of the years have our Alaska legislators actually been following the SBA law, student-based allocation law, for the funding for education. If they were to follow the law currently this year, our education system should technically be seeing a $130 million decrease to their budget based on SBA. But these legislators are doing everything they can to change that and make sure they get even more money for the worst education in the nation. They tried to tote how early education, pre-K through 12 education, has such great outcomes. But the studies that I have been seeing coming out on that have been really, really mixed reviews, and it's not been the best outcomes in the majority of the cases that have been peer reviewed. The results of early education has shown that later on, by the 9th grade, they're actually doing worse than those children that did not participate in early education. They're not able to read as well, they're not learning as well when they get into school, and that's just what they don't want to tell you, because they want to keep the perpetual myth alive that the more money you throw into something, the better it will get. Our current school system is teaching CRT in school, and they know it, and they knowingly are promoting it on a daily basis. It is no longer a base on how well you can do in school. It's all about equity outcome. So if you're the best student in the world and you have these other low-performing students that are also in the same school, the school's objective now isn't to uplift that best-performing student and help them keep achieving even more than they possibly could before. The goal is to bring that student back down to the level of the failing students. That way there is an equity in outcome for all. And not saying that those students that are performing badly don't need extra help, but they're not being pushed to do better. They're not receiving that extra help. No, they're just stifling down the rest of them and saying you guys need to drop your performance levels to match what everybody else is doing. CRT also is saying that, because if you're not a person of color, you are not a part of the minority that has been suppressed, and your equity outcome is higher than those of people of color. And we need to change that. We need to make sure you people of non-color are held back so the people of color can be pushed forward. Yet the outcome-based, when you throw race into the mix, creates even worse results than if you were to actually follow the teachings of Martin Luther King, where color means nothing. The substance of a person's equity or equality should be the word. Equality, not equity. Equality is based upon the merits of what they're able to achieve in life by their own ethical standards of moving themselves forward, and race and color should never have nothing to do with that. It is how good you are at what you do. Again, this bill is completely corrupt. They're pushing HB 259 as fast as they can through right now. They know they have the minority 51% votes that they need. At least they think they do. This is an election season, so anybody that does vote onto this is going to find themselves mutilated at the polls, and I guarantee I'll be one of the ones screaming the loudest for anybody that does vote for this. Over in the Senate, they got SB 199 and SB 200. Those are nearly identical to what this HB 259 bill is, and they too want to make sure that that is being fast-tracked. That bill is in the Senate Finance From my understanding, it's going to sit in the Senate Finance. They've got a committee meeting that was supposed to be yesterday, and they canceled it. I'm still waiting for notes or resolution of when that bill is going to come forward once again. I do not know when it's going to happen, but from what mainstream media like the ADN and them are all reporting out there, this bill is going to be fast-tracked. It's only going to go through the Senate Finance Committee. Once it's out of the Senate Finance Committee, it's going to go directly to the Senate floor to be voted on. And if we go by those that are in control of they claim no binding caucus in the Senate, but you can clearly see it by the vote. The binding caucus is there. I'm pretty sure they're going to find the 51% votes that they need to pass that through. The whole objective behind these bills in both the Senate and the House is to make it so that they get these bills to pass, and they're going to go in front of the governor, who they know outright is going to veto these bills. They know outright that they do not have the 3/4 votes to override the veto. And then the Democrats and the far left Republican rhinos out there are going to use this as a smear job for the upcoming campaign season, saying, see, we put forward these solutions, long-term solutions. And the governor and the Republican Party out there said no, they don't want a long-term solution. They don't care about Alaskans. They're going to completely twist the truth. The reality is the only people that don't care about Alaskans is the Democrats, the far left, and the rhinos in control down out in Juneau. Their sole concern is the special interests, the Alaska AFL unions, NEA of Alaska, education, healthcare, nonprofits like the Ramsonson Foundation and other organizations like that out there throughout the state. They want to make sure they receive the millions and billions of funding that comes through our government every single year directly deposited into their pockets. That's the reason why they're pushing bills like HB259 that gives 50% of the draw of the ERA POMV draw directly to them every year. That's what this bill does. Well, they took $3.1 billion last year. That means they would get $1.55 billion handed to them. Their current budget is only $1.3 billion. That is a $255 million budget increase to education if this bill is to pass. Talk about corrupt government. This is exactly what we have sitting down there. Please don't forget to like and share. Alaskans need to hear the truth about what's going on down in there in Juneau. There's another bill that's going to be heard later on today in regards to the PFD. I think it's HB 37 here in the House once again. This is a bill by Adam Wool that they've been pushing through the special sessions last year. And that this is another one that is just another glorified step-up type PFD payment program that they may or may not pay us a PFD depending on the whim of the legislators of the year. And this just is another corrupt way of them trying to subvert the laws that we have. Each and every one of these repeals the statutory PFD law and makes it as if it does not exist, and puts all the funding that is in the earnings reserve account, the ERA, directly into the hands of legislators to dictate at a whim of a vote of 51% on whether or not we see a PFD, or if they want to spend every penny of it on everything they want to spend it on and not give us a PFD. This doesn't resolve nothing. It just solidifies their theft and makes it easier for them without having the fight that they've had to deal with the last 7 years now over the permanent fund dividend. Again, please like and share this video. Alaskans need to hear the truth. Go to my website, politidic.com. Click that support button. It makes sure that I have the time available to be here to be able to live stream this instead of out working and earning a living. I will be able to have the income needed to be able to cover the expenses to make sure that I can be here to do that for you. To also show up at assembly meetings, school board meetings, and everything else. The more you guys show your support, the more you guys donate towards the cause, the easier it'll be for me to be able to make more and more and more of these events. I love to turn this into a full-time job, exposing them, live streaming everything unfiltered, uncut. That way you guys get to hear it all without the media far left or spin that the 90% of our media gives us on a daily basis. So again, like, share, go to the website politidic.com, click that support button. You guys all have a great afternoon, and I hope to be here later to be able to live stream the HB 37. All depends on work, which just seems like just texted in right now. We will talk to you guys all later. Thanks.